Astonishing Legends would like to thank Babbel, Quip, Mac Weldon, The Great Courses Plus, and our contributors at Patreon for making tonight's show possible.
We had a little fun during the dark week last week with our special guest Jorma Taccone, who gave us his hilarious perspective on what it's like to actually wear and act in a $150,000 monkey costume that took 4 hours to put on every day. In the weeks prior, we covered the story of the Patterson Gimlin film itself, the background of all the major players, and the accusations of it possibly being hoaxed. Next week, we're going to take a super deep dive with costume designer Bill Munns on whether or not you could have even made a costume that looked like Patty back in 1967. He should know. His work on Return of the Living Dead, The Beastmaster, and Swamp Thing is greatly respected. He's also become an expert analyst of the Patterson Gimlin film itself, so come back next week for that. But tonight it's time to tackle the scientific community's reaction to the PGF. This is where the rubber meets the road, or the scientists meet Patty. When we started this series, we expected, as we do with many of our topics, to dive deep into their analyses of the PGF and mine the data with the most research behind it. After all, this film, if real, is the holy grail of Bigfoot evidence, isn't it? Countless researchers with varying degrees and expertise must have thoroughly studied it. Well, it turns out, a lot of scientists dismissed the Patterson Gimlin film outright, or if they did examine it, they were ambivalent about their findings. Some film experts just shook their heads and walked out of the room, mumbling under their breath, after only one viewing. It would seem that poor Patty was too hot of a potato for many respectable authorities to tackle. A handful of scientists weighed in on Patty in spite of that, and you'll be surprised at what they said. In fact, some of them seemed surprised by their own observations. In a few cases, blatant skepticism evolved into the stalwart belief that Patty was real.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
To make sense of Bigfoot as a phenomenon, we have to try to understand why it persists. If Bigfoot is not an animal, but an invention, how do human actors keep the legend going, generation after generation? Anthropologist David Daegling from his 2004 book, Bigfoot Exposed.
Join us tonight for part 4 of our in-depth series on the Patterson Gimlin film.
And we're back.
Tonight, it's time to Science Patty.
Don't try to be all hip, man. You just sound ridiculous.
You're right. Okay, well, here's something I think people are going to enjoy. You guys know that we added pint glasses to our store with our logo on them, right? And apologies, because we had a snafu with how they were listed, so they were hard to find the first few days, but they're in there now. Well, tonight we get to announce something else about the glasses.
David Spencer, this is your moment. So grab the kids and play this over the speakers.
Oh, a nice announcer voice. Mm-hmm. For those of you that don't know, one of our listeners is the incredibly talented graphic artist, David Spencer. Everyone who follows us on our social media knows who he is.
Social media. Social media.
Social media. It's like social media.
Yeah, I think your abbreviations and acronyms are clever, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah, there's a fine line between stupid and clever.
That's Spinal Tap.
Yes,
very good.
Yes,
okay.
Well then, anyway, if you follow us on our social media and have seen the header image that's currently on our Twitter account and Facebook pages, then you've seen David Spencer's work. And some of you may even remember that some time ago, he did an unsolicited piece that depicts Forrest and I in a childlike way inside a wonderful rendition of Blanket Fortiana, which is what we call our studio. We were so fond of it, we wanted to translate it to something in the store, and now we have.
You can now find pint glasses with the Blanket Fortiana image on them in full color in our store at Astonishing Legends, as well as all of our sponsor codes by the listing at the top there. Just go to sponsor codes.
But wait, there's more.
In true paranormal style, Scott seems to think these are going to fly off the shelves.
That I do. And if they do, then we will be commissioning David Spencer to create a limited edition collector's set of glasses done in his inimitable style. Those of you from our generation, the ancient ones I'll call you, may remember the Burger King and McDonald's collector glasses from our youth.
Yes, collect all 7.
Indeed. So, not sure how many we're going to do yet, but we already have at least a few characters from the Astonishing Legends canon lined up. We may even get Tess to come up with a nomination process. However, this is only going to happen if it seems like something you guys want. So, we'll have to see if anyone even wants the Blanket Fortiana glasses, which I like so much, I'm already setting like a dozen aside to assuage the hoarder in me. And just a quick reminder, folks, we wanted to tell you about our favorite new podcast aggregation app. It's called Himalaya. Go find it. It's a cross-platform app that you can get for your Android or your iPhone or whatever. You can even get it online. Download it and find Astonishing Legends there and give us a follow.
All right, folks. Well, it's time to tunnel down even deeper into the rabbit warren of angles that have revealed themselves to us in our series on the Patterson Gimlin film. So tonight, we're going to listen to what the experts have to say. The very few experts that have bothered to weigh in. Actually, there are several experts who are specialists in primate locomotion, morphology, even hands and feet of primates, and we'll hear from them. But keep in mind, as we do, you're not going to hear a lot of really detailed scientific debunking of this, the Patterson Gimlin film, because most of them didn't even bother to look at it or make comments.
Yeah, this has created a kind of conundrum with it, because the people that believe in it, actually, a lot of them want to hear from experts, but a lot of the experts are afraid of the hot potato of taking Bigfoot seriously scientifically.
Yeah, you can't even consider it. Just to consider it makes you a wacko. But the few that have, that's not to say that there aren't criticisms with what's seen in the film. And there's a couple of flip sides to this. There's more than two flip sides.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a dodecahedron.
Ooh.
There are criticisms, of course, and favorable comments and analyses of the film, but the ones that are critical, I like them because they're not looking at the social aspects of what kind of guy Roger was or the timeline or how they got the film developed and all that. It's looking specifically at what's in the film, which is what we should be doing because that is the scientific approach.
Scientific approach to the empirical evidence that the film itself is, which is irrelevant to all the people around it that made the film.
Right. So when you do that, you're taking a look at what's in the film and asking, is this possibly a hoax? Could this have been done by human beings or not? And when you do that, then if you rule out it being possible for humans to do these motions and actions in the configuration of time and space that we know of, or can only assume by estimates of this film, then you look at it two ways. Okay, so if it can't be done, then what is making these motions? What is that thing? If it can be done, then how is it done? And can it be duplicated? So one thing I'll say here before we get started, and we hear from these scientists who have weighed in, is that a lot of the consensus has been, well, I don't like this about it, or this doesn't look right. And it could be done by a human or could not. You'll hear both sides of that argument. But nobody, scientist, enthusiast, Bigfooter, debunker, or skeptic, has been able to outright prove it's a hoax. They've only left the door open for that possibility. So it's still a hot button issue for a lot of people who have actually taken a look at this and have an interest in this. So first, what we're going to do is look a little bit back onto the history of what happened at the time that the film came out and how was it received? What's the history there? And then we'll look at some of the more major hypotheses and deductions and even theories about what is actually seen on this film from the more notable scientists and experts and even just learned enthusiasts. Because as we've seen, some of the most learned people about these kinds of subjects aren't ones who have gotten a degree in them at some highfalutin university. They've just devoted decades to its study and over that time have accumulated a lot of knowledge, which is worthwhile. So we can start off here by looking at a few conclusions that Chris Murphy had about Bob Hieronymus's claim about being hoaxed by him solely, and he was in cahoots with Roger, and I guess in turn, Bob Gimlin. Chris Murphy makes the following points. One, that it's ironic that the Patterson Gimlin film issue is a reflection of the entire Bigfoot question. Scientists want a body before they will recognize the creature. Bigfoot believers want a costume before they will recognize that the film is a hoax. Quote, no matter how much circumstantial evidence one gathers, such is still not hard evidence. It's entirely possible the film is a hoax because, as the saying goes, anything is possible. The same is not true of probability. Here, one must go far beyond hearsay and truly judge evidence on its own merits. And I think that's a good way to go forward here. What he's saying is that, yes, you can't rule out it being a hoax. And that's what has made this debate so lively and long-living. If it had been proven a hoax a long time ago, we wouldn't be hearing about it, other than what a fantastic and fun hoax that was for the 70s. But it hasn't, so the question is still open. And so that being a possibility that the film is a hoax, well, you keep that on the table, you look at everything again as the approach that we like to take. But as I tell Scott, we're neither totally believing or totally skeptical just for the sake of either.
That's right.
There are those who wish we were buying into one topic more than others. I'm sure there are a lot more comments from people that wish we were more skeptical on some issues, but that's fine. We're going to let the story and what we find dictate that, not just to be skeptical for skepticism's sake. So if you're seeing some kind of evolution of belief here or thinking, that's kind of what's happening over the course of this series, is that we're letting what we find guide our thinking and reasoning on this. And so to us, there are things that are going to be more probable than others, while still considering everything.
So tonight, we're going to start off by telling the story of how the film was first received by the scientific community immediately after the incident. Then we're going to summarize a few of the conclusions by the more commonly referenced scientists who've actually weighed in on the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Yeah, the conclusions, the ones that aren't outright dismissals after a single viewing, came about after studying and analyzing the film for some time. It seems, though, that no researcher was convinced of Bigfoot's existence right after the screening. It just wasn't enough for them.
So focusing on what Forrest was saying a minute ago, there were two primary aspects of the creature in the film that scientists have dissected over the years: the morphology, or the body dimensions of Patty, and of course her walk.
Ooh, dissecting.
Yes, dissecting.
Well, that's what they would have liked.
If they could have caught her, they would have liked that. Then we get into a whole other ethical and moral issue.
Yes, indeed.
There's no debate that Patty or whatever is on that film isn't an actual being. The question is what's on the film more human or more ape-like, or some kind of compelling combination of both? And then are these dimensions and motions even humanly possible? Because if not, then we can say there's no way that it's a hoax. But then going back to the social science aspect, if it is humanly possible, is it probable they would have been known about by Roger Patterson? And if it's Bob Hieronymus in a suit, him too. Would he be an expert on primate movement? Would either one of those two men be an expert on primate movement to the point where it would fool a scientist with regard to her gait and locomotion?
Yeah, that's always the big question. People could say, well, look, it's humanly possible, but is it possible by these humans?
Did these two cowboys conspire and effectively have they been fooling anthropologists ever since the film was shot in 1967?
Right, because it's one thing to know what a primate might walk like. We're going to take a look at some primate motions, one being a compliant gait, which is also debated amongst the anthropologists today, if that is a real factor with primates, locomotion. And if these guys knew that, could they pull it off? Certainly that walk can be taught, but how well could these guys have done that and have an excellent suit to boot? Okay, so now first we're going to take a look at the initial scientific reaction, the reception by scientists as soon as the film was shot, probably within a month or two. And we're going to go back in history here and just kind of see what actually happened when the film is first introduced by people who are experts, or you hope to have experts look at it. And that says something about the motivations of Patterson. Well, in regards to how people took Patterson's actions and attitudes at the time surrounding the incident and gauging his behavior and acting. Was he acting? Was he acting naturally? There's the statement, you could say, by proponents, well, he wouldn't have acted that way if it was a hoax.
Right, which I actually said, and we've been called out upon that.
Well, you can look at it that way, but the counter to that is that's exactly how he would have acted if it was a hoax. Well, if he was good at acting or genuinely excited, of course he's going to act in a convincing manner either way. And logically, Patterson's supporters make a point that if it was a hoax, even a well-executed one, Roger Patterson illogically wanted a lot of scrutiny of the film. So you can kind of parse this back and forth. But my point here in making this comment is that either way, if he was a good actor or if he was genuinely excited, then it's going to be convincing. His actions and attitudes. You can say, well, there you go. That's the conspiracy theory thing. It's like, that's what they want you to believe.
Yeah.
No, the government's trying to get you to think that way. Well, that's how they would act exactly because you're falling into it. So it's just a logic loop there. You can go back and forth. But what you can say is if Patterson acted too nervously and skittishly or just weird in wanting some people to look at it, not others, and he's acting really cagey about it, then yeah, you could draw suspicions about his motivations here and what really went on. Why doesn't he want a bunch of people to look at it? But that wasn't the case. He wanted the scientific community to have a look immediately. He wanted them to take it seriously because he believed it was convincing evidence. So logically, if you did commit a hoax for fame and profit, would you want a lot of scientific scrutiny? Well, maybe that's part of your clever scheme here. But more analyzation brings more possibility of it being found out.
Right.
That just makes sense.
Yeah. And so it's funny because a lot of people, we've read in several of these books that there seems to be an overarching implication that hoaxers are not that well educated, not that bright. They're just practical jokesters and they're getting in on this. And then there's other people that if you're still thinking this is a hoax, then the other side of the spectrum here is that Roger Patterson is a freaking genius.
He's one of those rare criminal geniuses.
Yeah, because I mean, we always talk about J.T. Walsh in The Grifters, but he was a genius. He winds up losing his mind, but he is also a fictional character. Like con artists with that kind of extreme skill don't really exist that much in the wild. They're out there, but they're super rare. And I don't think Roger Patterson was one of them. That's just my personal, and I know I've got all my confirmation bias. I should wear a shirt that says confirmation bias.
Ooh, that's a good idea. Oh, wait, but we're going to put that in the store.
But that's the point, though. I'm just saying, so yeah, him wanting the scientists to look at it, calling people to bring down tracking dogs. By the way, when we said the dogs never made it, that was because of the rain. So maybe he made a horrible rainstorm come in too, because he's God. No, that's my whole point. It gets to be ridiculous. But the flip side of that is he would have had to been a narcissistic sociopath who thought that his con was so good that they could bring every scientist in the world and they would never catch him because he was such a genius. Again, not how this man has been described by his friends, including Bob Gimlin, who we met and asked about him.
Oh, yeah. Well, none of his friends thought the two of them had, I'm not going to say the smarts, they're smart guys, but in practical working class ways, and they certainly know their business of horsemanship, but are they primate experts? Are they film experts and all that? And you know what? Going to your point about J.T. Walsh, he goes crazy, and that is like the crazy genius. The other thing that does not exist really in life is the criminal genius Lex Luthor type, because imagine what trouble we'd all be in if that were the case.
One other point I want to make here before we get back on to your outline here is that would mean that Roger Patterson went from thinking that he could make a living or a fair amount of money off of tiny wooden wagons and goats or ponies and horses that he was going to take and sell to petting farms. He went from that to executing the most brilliant money-making Bigfoot scheme of all time, which, by the way, it also didn't make that much money. It did, but Al Diatley took it all. So just keeping all of that in mind, because there's the other side of it. Brilliant hoax, a lot of work went into it. Planned it out, studied primates, fooled all these anthropologists and fooled all these experts on primate locomotion, yet allowed himself to then be conned out of all the money from it by his opportunistic brother-in-law.
Yes.
It doesn't jive. Anyway, sorry.
So the con man getting conned aspect here. Well, look at the other hoaxes and hoaxers that have surfaced throughout the years since this time period here, like those two guys, remember, who had the fake Bigfoot, which was a massive fur in a styrofoam cooler, and they threw a bunch of guts onto it.
Yeah, that was just a few years ago, right?
Yeah, I didn't even bother to look that up.
To me, I'm old, so I guess it probably could have been like 10 years or something, but yeah.
It wasn't that long, but maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years at the most. And my first thinking in seeing that, because remember they showed some kind of vague, not blurry photos, but they were a little vague, not too detailed, something that looked like it was made out of brown acrylic fur with some guts on it, and I thought, like,
here it is.
Did you hit it with your car? Like, what happened to this thing?
This is from Snopes. Bigfoot captured. Rick Dyer claims he lured the creature with $200 worth of ribs before trapping and killing it on September 6, 2012. He plans to take the body on a nationwide tour.
That's right.
Yeah,
there
you go.
Well, you look at that, and you look at Ray Wallace with the wooden feet, cutout forms, tromping around the woods, and just the lifelong things that he did where it really got silly.
Yeah.
And I kind of get it. We talked about this before at the time here. We talked about the series where I could see doing that. I do enjoy a fun-filled practical joke, which you then tell the person about soon after, before they ruin their lives over it or make a fool of themselves, that, like him putting the tracks around the bulldozer or whatever,
Yes.
the piece of machinery here. And the guy freaking out like, oh my gosh, look at this. And then having a laugh. And then later on, soon after that, you tell the guy like, no, come on, I did that. It was kind of funny though. Just to get a rise out of somebody, a coworker. Yeah, I can see doing that. But doing that for a lifelong practice where then you're in the news and you're selling posters and you don't really have to because you have a successful construction company, it's a little weird in that I think you like the attention. I mean, sure, you like a laugh, but there are easier ways to get one than carrying this hoax kind of thing and furthering it and pumping it up for years until your dying days. Then you admit to it, or I guess the family knew, so it was okay to come out with that. And he'd admitted it to some close people, of course, and he had the footprints made. They had them carved by a friend. But what has been found around that, as I said, is I don't doubt that he probably did fake some tracks, but the variety and the locations seem, again, going back to that question of probability, that he couldn't have done all of them with all the variations in the prints and the dermal ridges found and the deformities in some feet. Like, so you had a set of, 100 different wooden casts. It starts to become improbable to me that he could have been the founder of all this Bigfoot lore. Well, going back to what happened back in the day, Patterson really wanted everybody to see this because he believed, if you believe him, he believed in the material that he shot as being authentic, of course, because he was there and he always claimed that. He and Bob Gimlin had always sworn that this thing was real. It really happened, and maybe they were hoaxed by some expert crazy genius and a futuristic ape suit, but what they saw and experienced then that day was genuine. So back in the day of 1967, November 1967, Life magazine had contacted Patterson and pitched the possibility of a photo story on the film. But first, they wanted their own scientific vetting of it, which makes sense. Life magazine was taken very seriously. It's Time Life. They're one of the bigger magazines. They're still around now. They had kind of a hiatus, went out of business for a while. They're back. Always since the mid-century, they've been taken seriously in a major magazine of note, of record. So they are going to want their own proof before they go with this guy who may or may not seem shady. Who knows? They don't know him yet, so they wanted their own vetting. So they arranged for a scientific screening at the American Museum of Natural History. Patterson, Gimlin, and Diatley went to New York City to present the film. Well, the scientists in attendance didn't seem all that impressed, and it looked as though they had already made up their minds before viewing it that it was a hoax. They viewed it only once, didn't take any measurements or notes, didn't look at any stop frames or even ask questions. And within 15 minutes after the viewing, the three were told that the film was, quote unquote here, not kosher. So that was it.
And that's indicative, I think, of it's a closed-minded attitude in a way, because I think these scientists are sitting down and, like you said, it seems like they've already made up their minds.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what's on the film. They can't see it. They can't receive it. They can't analyze it critically because for them, the possibility of Bigfoot doesn't exist. So the film doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Even though it's being projected right in front of them.
Right. It's on the table. It's only a minute long. It's not like it's 2 hours and I got to sit through a documentary. It's 60 seconds, of footage. And they saw it once, didn't ask to, hey, that was interesting. Could we see it again?
Well, yeah, and that's part of the problem with Patty is that she's bipedal. She walks like a human being, whether she's real or not.
That's true. Yeah.
It's very hard to conjecture whether or not it's a person. If they had gotten footage of a Bigfoot and it was crab walking upside down like the exorcism of Emily Rose,
right.
Then at least they have to say, okay, people really cannot walk like that.
Yeah.
And we're predating CGI. But then it's like, if it's a tall, bipedal, furry thing walking like a person and you're already predisposed to believing that it can't possibly exist, then immediately you see it and there's nothing to convince you that it's not a person in a cursory one-time watching of it. Bam, you're done. It's a hoax.
Yeah, well, again, it's not on the table at all. So
yeah,
you can't have an analyzation of it. The only conclusion you're going to have is that it's fake. Well, it got a little better, but not much, when Life magazine then asked animal experts at the Bronx Zoo for a second opinion, and they seemed to be a little bit more interested. They asked to see it several more times, along with viewing several stop frames at least. But in conclusion, though, they rejected the film and said there was, quote unquote, something wrong with the film. And they didn't elaborate any further. And with that second denial, Life magazine lost interest in covering it.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the end of that. It's like, well, okay, not so favorable. But they didn't say what was wrong with it. That's all they said. So again, it's not an analyzing where you're saying what's wrong with it. You just don't think it's possible, probably.
Right.
And not wanting to put your neck out there speculating about it. But while Patterson was in New York, he contacted Ivan T. Sanderson, who became a proponent of the film after viewing it and personally helped to get it shown to some scientific audiences. But also, Sanderson contacted Argosy magazine, who had expressed interest in getting other scientists to view it. They then arranged for 4 noted scientists, along with the Director of Management Operations for the U.S. Department of the Interior, for a screening. Also present were journalists and an editorial representative from National Geographic magazine. Now, the film and still frames were examined under high magnification, so this time it's a deeper look at least. But again, no one was that impressed, as the New York Times didn't report on it, and the Post ran an article on page 12, and the National Geographic Society completely dismissed it. The only positive outcome was that no one said it was a hoax. So at least at that early stage, no one's denouncing the film as a fraud. But even still, there was a little serious interest by a few North American scientists, although the response from a screening in 1969 at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. yielded basically the same responses as that scientific screening in British Columbia, with the same objections coming up about the peculiar walk, the sagittal crest, and then about the short toes and the odor.
Yeah.
Just like that could describe a few people we know. Well, about the short toes, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, who we're going to cover later on, he's from Idaho State University, says that Patty does not have short toes. It just appears that way because there's an extended sole pad at the base of the toes. And that's just not a funky apartment. That's talking about the sole pad. That is the padding of the foot padding at the base of the feet. And what we'll get into later is why that might be. And it's thought possibly because of the massive weight of this thing. But in any case, it's a weird foot by either ape or human standards, which is, again, that's an ingenious kind of thing, which I'll give Ray Wallace if he didn't know anything about it or he wasn't taking that cue from any other previous sightings, of which there have been plenty. It's not like he made that up. The idea of a large human-looking foot. I give him credit for going with that rather than a 3-toed alien or something else kind of weird. But one scientist at that Smithsonian screening, Dr. John Napier, was intrigued enough by the film and other evidence that he later wrote his own book titled Bigfoot. And it was Dr. Napier who examined the dermal ridges in the Cripplefoot Bigfoot tracks and initially identified the deformation in the track as clubfoot. That's also not a club. That is what we talked about. Actually, we did talk about that a little bit in Loftus Hall. Yeah. Well, Napier would go on to become director of the primate biology program at the Smithsonian. But one interesting thing about the Cripplefoot tracks is that, again, we're showing a little variety. So if you're a hoaxer, nice touch. You're adding something that anthropologists and people who are extremities experts are being fooled by, and the extremely difficult, if not impossible, feat of adding dermal ridges, which are essentially fingerprints.
Pun intended.
What?
Feet. Feet. F-E-A-T.
Feet. Ah, very nice. Yes.
That, in the case of this Bigfoot, that would be a big feet.
Yeah, very nice.
Yes,
okay.
you're welcome.
Well, there was also one notable proponent of the film, or at least somebody who gave it kind of a thumbs up, primate thumbs up, Dr. Osmond Hill, who is head of the Yerkes Regional Primate Research Center at Emory University. And after a screening, he said that if the PGF was a hoax, it was extremely well done and effective, and that it was strong enough evidence that an expedition to collect further evidence should be mounted. So we're going to hear that phrase quite a bit, so I apologize in advance. And that is going to be from the experts, and that, well, if it is a hoax, it's really well done. Nice.
Yes.
Argosy magazine, which, by the way, I got the Final Jeopardy tonight, or last night.
Oh, did you?
Show. It came up. as in Final Jeopardy as a question. Remember the guy who's been winning 15 shows in a row?
Yeah,
here?
he's past $1 million now.
That's right. That was the final question.
People are getting bored, I'm reading.
I'm sure he's not. I'm sure after a while he's tired of finding new shirts to wear.
He'll take a dive.
New stories, yes. Well, Argosy magazine, however, they were impressed with the film, and they published an article by Ivan Sanderson in their February 1968 issue. And in that article, Sanderson said that Patterson, Gimlin, and Diatley had taken the film to Hollywood to be examined by motion picture special effects technicians. We'll mention that a little bit later. So apparently their response was negative in that they're not lauding the film, but as we'll see a little bit later, they seem to be also baffled by it. So we'll take a look at some of the Hollywood reactions towards the end of this episode because they're interesting, and I wouldn't say as definitive possibly as the scientific conclusions or the analyses, but interesting from a costume aspect of it, getting back to that angle.
Yeah, which we're going to go deep on that too.
Yes. So. Well, even though the scientific community largely ignored the film, it gained attention in North America, as we talked about earlier. It was a little bit of a sensation, not much, but it became known. And along with Argosy, 3 other major magazines ran with the story, and that was National Wildlife, West Magazine, and Reader's Digest, which also published it in their international edition, giving it a wider audience with European readers. And I know not many people even know what Reader's Digest is nowadays. I'm not sure what they're reading or digesting, but it was a big deal when I was growing up, and that's where you'd find a lot of these fun little stories. Well, that's what got the Lagina brothers excited. Remember about Oak Island? I read that same exact article. And it being the digest, it's a shortened version, or, they're readable bites. So it's nice to pick up a story or two while you're waiting for something. And so they had a huge readership, and that kind of made them more known in Europe. But mostly it was a North American phenomenon, and of course Canada, because they live with it and they have a much more open attitude about it, in Western Canada anyway. But largely, I think the guys who were trying to get the film noticed eventually realized that they couldn't depend solely on North America and its scientists.
Comment allez-vous?
Bien, merci.
Ah, très bien. You've been using your Babbel app.
Je l'utilise, meaning I have been, I think. I don't know. I still need to get through my beginner courses. But I'll tell you, I'm learning through the Babbel app right now on my phone, and it's really a lot of fun. Man, I wish I had Babbel when I was in school, because I always remember kind of dreading the language classes.
Yes, the ones that are immersive, where the teacher asks you a question 3 times and you just blankly stare back at them and get embarrassed.
Yeah, I know that's the traditional way to learn a language in class, but it was usually a little intimidating, and you always felt under pressure to perform. But Babbel is the new, fun, and easy way to learn a language you've always wanted to learn. With zero pressure, you learn at your own pace, either online or as a mobile app like we're doing.
And your progress is synced across all your devices. You learn through interactive dialogues and speech recognition technology, so you can perfect your pronunciation and accent. Babbel is like that non-judgmental language teacher you wish you'd started with.
And the way their lessons are designed, they're a lot of fun to take, and they make sense. Babbel starts off by saying a word in the language you're learning, then you repeat it, and then it lets you know if you're on the mark. Then you choose the correct translations and spellings of the words you've just learned, use them in a conversation, and so on. Anyway, it's engaging and it's convenient, with the lessons being only 10 to 15 minutes, which you can do anywhere. And again, zero pressure from a teacher and no snickering classmates.
It reminds me of the learning apps my son used to use, but this one's for anyone. Babbel is a proven and effective teaching method that's designed to get you speaking your new language within weeks, not months or years. And no language course is effective if you don't stick with it. So the fact that it's the #1 selling language app in the world should tell you something about how easy and enjoyable it is to use.
Just go try it out for free and start with any of their 14 languages to choose from, and start having fun talking to people in other languages.
C'est bon. Yeah, to try Babbel for free, download the Babbel app or go to Babbel.com.
One more time, try it for free by downloading the Babbel app or go to Babbel.com. That's Babbel, Babbel.com.
Hi, I'm General Josh Mikowski from Erie, Pennsylvania, home of the Pepperoni Ball, Smith's Hot Dogs, and the Pizza Bomber. And you're listening to Astonishing Legends with Scott Philbrook and Forrest Burgess. Now, back to the show.
Now, because Roger had been looking at Bigfoot for quite some time before this happened. And he was actually known to the researchers we had mentioned earlier in the series, Renee DeHenden and John Green, personally, before the sighting at Bluff Creek. And there was nothing to indicate to them that the film was a hoax, but they certainly had to consider that possibility.
Well, of course, yeah, you're putting your name to this and your reputation and your livelihood in a way. So you also want to confirm that this guy's not just a goofy key jangling hoaxster.
And that comes around to a point of something that we've learned over the years of doing our series. The people who manage to claw their way up and be taken seriously as researchers in these kind of phenomenon, because there's not a lot of them, but the ones that do, they guard their reputations very, very carefully because they know that there is a good portion of people out there when it comes to exploring something like this, like a cryptid, or if you're, say, J. Allen Hynek and you're exploring UFOs or that kind of thing, there's people coming out of the woodwork that are probably not quite right, and there you have to be careful that you don't besmirch your own reputation by engaging with them. So no matter what the relationship is, DeHenden and Green have to be real careful about this. By the way, we have some amazing pictures of Renee DeHenden that we were given permission to use by listener Rob the Toon Man on Twitter. And so if you go to the website for this particular episode, you'll see some of those pictures that he sent in of him and his daughter posing with Renee DeHenden and John Green before they passed away. They've both moved on to the other world now, so they know the truth, but we don't, unfortunately. Anyway, as I said, they had to be careful. They had to make sure that this wasn't a hoax, even though they knew who Roger was. They checked out the backgrounds for both Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, and nothing popped up as a red flag for hoaxing, with DeHenden paying extra close attention for anything in the film that might give it away as a hoax. Now, while DeHenden and Green had come across some discrepancies about some of the details of the incident that came their way or that they discovered when they were looking into everything, they didn't feel like any of those were a red flag for it being a hoax. So Everyone who knows the story of the Patterson-Gimlin film knows that the details they're a little fluid at moments as the story's retold from Roger and what's been told from Bob. They move around a little bit, but this is an eyewitness account of something that took about 60 seconds and was incredibly exciting and crazy if you believe that it wasn't a hoax. There's some latitude there for a difference of opinion or a difference of the experience. When something like that happens to you, you're also in a state of shock.
Right.
So the way that you relay those details, it's not going to be some ironclad thing.
Well, what you just mentioned there is one of the criticisms of the film that's often brought up, and it's that tit for tat, back and forth, rondelay of logic or reasoning, in that you could say, well, if this was a hoax, then these guys would have gotten their story straight. It would have been ironclad. They would have worked it out. Every other detail was worked out perfectly. All the timing of getting out of there, getting the film, planting all that stuff, dressing up. They got out of there before a rainstorm and got back and got developed, blah, 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 whatever they did. Perfectly executed, and so their stories of what happened would have been ironclad. But then you have others that would say, well, these discrepancies, they make me give pause to the whole thing, that their stories aren't straight. So who saw what? Kind of like what Greg Long has said about the film, in that if it were any other incident, some kind of commonplace thing, then maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal. But since this is such a big claim and an outrageous claim by Patterson and Gimlin, that this must be scrutinized and these discrepancies must be taken into account.
Well, and this comes back to your allegory, which we've brought up at least a few times on the show over the years, but haven't brought up lately. And,
well, then
I want
time.
Yeah, let's do it again. It's the whole thing about the truck. I was hit by a truck. I saw that person get hit by a truck. Was it a blue truck or a red truck? It was a blue truck. Later, it turns out the truck was red. Does that change the fact that the person was hit by the truck? No, it doesn't. And so what's happening is, I think a lot of times too, with people who are taking a skeptical look at things, when they find that somebody can't be precise about the details when they're telling a story over and over. By the way, Bob Gimlin's been telling the story now for how many years? From 1967 till now.
Yeah, he's 87 now.
Yeah, and even when we interviewed him, I could sense that he was like, okay, this is what I say about this thing. He's in almost like a tiger in a cage. He's saying the same things at this point because he's having to say it over and over and over again. Yeah. But the point is, people look at this and they look at an event like this, and not just this, whether it's the Welsh UFO flap, the school kids in Berwyn, or the kids in Zimbabwe that saw the UFO. If they don't all say the exact same thing, it's aha! gotcha. This whole thing is a lie
Mm.
because you couldn't tell this exactly the same way. Or you two people didn't see the exact same thing. So I'm sorry. I can't believe any of this. Bring me some real evidence.
Well-
And that's the thing that's like, okay, I'm going to shut down. You're just looking for this excuse. You're pulling a thread. They're pulling the thread. They're trying to unravel the sweater from this one thread.
Right. It's also that cycle of logic where it goes back and forth either way, depending, it's too blurry, it's not blurry enough. Here, it seems to be pretty good. It's not blurry, and therefore it's being analyzed.
People think it's blurry, though. This is the
right.
funny thing. People think this is blurry because it was shot on film with old lenses, but it's not really. For the time, it's actually very, very sharp. And because film is chemical and not digital, and it's 16 millimeter, which is a larger format, you can blow it up a huge amount and see a lot of extra detail.
No, exactly. So a note on that, which I think we talked about, but most people, what they see, especially in these GIFs that are now going around on the internet, that I think we put a few up ourselves, but you see it so often, you have to realize that is blown up from a large image. That image that you see, that iconic image of frame 352 or 354, or a little clip of Patty swinging her arms in one cycle of locomotion there and turning her head, that's been blown up from a tiny 16 millimeter frame, which is pretty sharp, but you're seeing a very zoomed in image.
Yes, and
so it looks
here's
blurry.
the other thing. It's been digitally zoomed in.
Right.
So it actually doesn't have the ability to zoom in effectively. It's making up information. Whereas if you're scanning the film and you have a scanner on it and you're dropping a lens down, a modern scanner lens on top of that frame, you can blow it up a whole lot and keep a lot of the information. But you can't fabricate information when you take a YouTube video and you download it and you pull it into After Effects and you stabilize it and then you blow that up 500%. That information that is present on maybe a first generation copy is not present when you do all the digital manipulation. It's not there because all the digital manipulation is based on the smaller size that the image originally was. You're not actually blowing into the physical film.
Yeah.
I don't know if I explained that right. But
probably not. But the idea is that Kodachrome is a very sharp color film for its day, always was through its history. That's why it's so beloved by photographers and they're nostalgic about it. And if you look at a high resolution scan like the one that we have on our website, which I think is 5K, it's actually pretty sharp. But yes, again, you're seeing it blown up and zoomed in so much that you're seeing the film grain, which is why it looks grainy. But my point about that argument is that, being too blurry, it's the Goldilocks. It's not enough. It's too much of this, too less of that. It's not even somewhere in the middle that's satisfying. And with the argument about their overall stories not matching, you could say like, well, there you go. Aha, they're not matching. But you could say the opposite if everything lined up. See, there you go. They've rehearsed this. It's much too concise because if it were real, they wouldn't agree on all the details. They'd get some of them wrong. But this is all rehearsed. See, it's obviously a hoax. So you're just lost here. It's a facile way of approaching an argument. Again, not analytical. You're just kind of like, well, there you go. Anything's possible. That's true. Or I saw this on one of the Bigfoot boards. I don't believe this because they could have faked that costume. Where there's a will, there's a way. It's like, well, that's pretty dumb.
Yeah.
Just look, there's been a will to cure cancer or travel to Mars by very smart people for a long time, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
So just because you have a will to do something doesn't mean it's possible by everybody at any time of their choosing. So again, not a great argument. But what happened in the 70s, Scott, when they didn't get much of a reception in North America or even Canada?
Well, in 71, DeHinden figured out that he wasn't going to get that far with the scientists in North America, both the U.S. and Canada, and he decided that he needed to go to Europe. The scientists there were more open-minded, but they essentially came to the same conclusions. DeHinden ended up traveling to England, Sweden, Switzerland, Finland, and using his own money, traveled to Russia, where he ended up having the most luck with getting the film to be seriously examined. And as you know from our Lake Baikal episode from many moons ago, the Russians seem to be a little bit more open to the paranormal.
Yeah, they're not as hung up. There's not as much of a stigma. And you know what? There's a point here I want to make that I thought was fascinating that I learned or realized and understood while watching the documentary Third Eye Spies about remote viewing and their attitude about it. One thing I realized about the authorities here in the U.S. is that there's kind of a cognitive dissonance in that they are very staunchly non-woo-woo, but also religiously and spiritually entertain a lot of woo-woo.
Yeah.
By no means casting any aspersions on religion. I'm just saying that when you have Russia, who started off, of course, with the teachings of Marx and Lenin, And in communism, there is no divine deity controlling everything. It's just the state. It's just people. So they're very materialistic. And one thing that the film said was that Lenin, in his approach, being an extreme materialist, in that, well, look, if there's some kind of mental apparatus that enables some people, seemingly, to read thoughts or get premonitions or target a location, whatever it is, they didn't have that back then, remote viewing, but certainly they were into studying ESP. Well, to them, being materialist, there's got to be something to it. Physical. There's a mechanism there that we can study, adapt, and learn and capitalize on. So it's not woo-woo to them. There's a rational explanation. I thought that was fascinating philosophically. And that's, ironically, they're much more open to this stuff because, like, well, no, if there are thousands of reports of some kind of ape in the woods, there's probably an ape in the woods. Well, we should go find out what that is. And in Russia, they have their own Russian Yeti. They have, as we saw in the Dyatlov Pass, the Mansi people there, the native tribal peoples, believe in the mink, and they're serious about it. Well, as I mentioned before in the series, I was over at Scott's house, house sitting for a weekend, and there was that documentary on the killer Russian Yeti. But they got some pretty interesting evidence, I would say, more so interviews, of course, with the local Mansi people who seem to be pretty serious about it. And they did get one good Bigfoot yell or whatever it was.
But I hadn't gotten that far. I only got to watch the first 15 minutes of that. I did not care for how liberally they were using the postmortem photos of the kids.
Yes. No, I know. It was
I just don't agree with that. But.
It was sensationalized, to be sure, but in getting the interviews, though, my point is that they take it seriously and they're not hung up on it. That's kind of the basic attitude there.
Well, and that's why Dehinden found that the Russians were taking this seriously. He actually went to the Russian Central Scientific Research Institute of Prosthetics and Artificial Limb Construction. They studied the creature's locomotion and concluded that it was extremely heavy.
Yeah, they were actually very interested in this film.
The weight was indicated to them by how the creature's arms swung and how the knees bent when the body weight came down on the foot. Interesting to note, they said, bulk can be simulated, but not massive weight. They also noted the large muscle mass. They agreed to do some biomechanical work with the film, but unfortunately, they never got around to it, nor did they publish any official report. This is the downside to the Russian examination.
Oh.
They'll look at stuff, but they're not going to tell you what they think about it.
Well, not
the reports, you can't get your hands on the reports. But
no, not from an official entire institution's point of view, but there are some individuals, some scientists who have looked at it and did issue a summary report of their thoughts and analysis of the film. And we're going to touch on the three reports that are most often cited here.
Well, this is going to be Igor, Dmitry, and Dmitry. Yeah, well, see, listen, here's the thing now. When we're in the U.S. and we're talking about this stuff, we got a lot of Bobs. Yeah. Now we're in Russia and we got a bunch of Dmitrys and Igor.
Very popular names.
Yeah,
certainly, yes. No, these two fellows here are well known with Bigfooters, especially of the time. They both got very involved in it because they believed in it and weren't afraid to say so, and had some very interesting thoughts and I think good attitudes about approaching the research here. So what we're going to look at next here are the individual scientists and experts, image experts, people who are familiar with the aspects you see in the film and what they thought and what their summary thoughts were, the more notable ones that you hear about all the time. And just so you don't think as we go along that we're favoring the positive reviews, the favorable outcomes and summaries of the PGF over the negative ones, I wanted to make a point here in that, yes, there are going to be more detailed positive outlooks on this film than detailed negative ones. Now, I will say that, as we talked about before, anthropologist David Daegling and his anthropology partner Daniel Schmidt wrote a pretty good, I thought, fair and balanced book about Bigfoot in general and the Patterson Gimlin film.
Bigfoot Exposed, an anthropologist examines America's enduring legend, which we've done some quoting from and we'll be doing more.
Right. But as far as like really breaking the film down and trying their own experiments and comparing their findings to the data presented to them by other scientists and what they thought about it, there aren't a lot of really detailed negative or unfavorable breakdowns of the PGF. There just aren't. What we're going to find here generally are scientists who study the film a little bit, but have problems with individual pieces of it or the data or conclusions of other scientists, not really going through it step by step, frame by frame, and saying what's wrong with it, just so you don't think, again, we're favoring one over the other. Or, of course, we have our own opinions about it. But the positive and negative will be interspersed throughout this next section here. So, yeah, the two Russians that Scott just mentioned, Igor Burtsev and Dmitry Bayanov, are two proponents of the film who've been very vocal about it and also interactive with the American research efforts. So unlike the previous scientific reception in Western Europe and North America and Canada that the film got so far, Igor Burtsev and Dmitry Bayanov from the Smolin Hominology Seminar affiliated with the Darwin Museum in Moscow, they were very interested in the film. And as we said before, part of this reason they're so open to it is that the Soviet Union has their own relic hominoids to study, and they take that research fairly seriously. They record it, they document it, they look into it. So Dehinden gave Burtsev and Bayanov copies of the film and footprint casts. The two then gave the PGF the most detailed analysis at that period in the mid-70s.
Right, so this is significant because this is a thorough technical analysis that is contemporaneous with when the film was made, as opposed to the ones that have been done decades later, which have obviously their own value and a very great value. But this is interesting because these guys are working in the same time period that the film was made. So they have all the considerations of what the most current technology at that time would have been with regard to being able to hoax it and understanding culture, global culture at that time, and the global ability to make something like this fake.
Yeah, and they're really the first two scientists to take it this seriously, where they are now going to really do a deep dive on this and a really detailed analysis. So they're significant for that fact alone. Just the first two, yeah, this looks interesting. We're going to take a look at it. Well, after studying the technical aspects of the film, like the frames per second rate and Patty's morphology and movement, Igor Burtsev and Dmitry Bayanov presented these conclusions. 1, the film passed all their tests and scrutiny within their 3 criteria of distinctiveness, consistency, and naturalness. Quote, the Patterson Gimlin film is an authentic documentary of a genuine female hominoid, popularly known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot, filmed in the Bluff Creek area of Northern California, not later than October 1967.
I want to point something out here at this point, too, because I feel like it might have slipped through the cracks a little bit in our overall presentation. It's a known to us, so we're not even mentioning it. I want it to be absolutely clear that the film has been thoroughly analyzed for the location of the shoot, and that many parties, Bigfoot researchers, have taken a very, very thorough look at the location and were able to find the exact spot in Bluff Creek. Most recently in 2011, I think.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah, there was a team that went back. There's been multiple teams there. A lot of the trees are still standing, and this is when we get back into Zapruder film territory. The trees have names. They've got a name for each tree. They call one the ladder tree, and then they've got another one that's leaning. I can't remember that one's name. But then they measured out the terrain. They found debris and things that were in the original shot that, believe it or not, are still there, which I was blown away by because I used to spend a lot of time near the Delaware River, and I was there for a couple of major floods. And I know areas like this area that Bob and Roger described with the log jam. And those areas don't usually stay the way they are for that many decades because there's other floods that happen in the intervening decades. So it was surprising to me that a lot of stuff is still there. It's now fairly overgrown, though, so it's harder to find now than it was even just 10 years ago. But the point is, we just want it to be abundantly clear for anyone who's not super familiar with this story that there is absolutely no question that this film was shot in Bluff Creek, not in Yakima or anywhere else. It was shot in Bluff Creek, and they know exactly where it was, and they have the coordinates for it, and we've shared those coordinates already in a prior episode of the show. So,
well, I didn't really think about that because there were claims that he shot it on the outskirts of Yakima.
Right, where he lived. He went there to hoax it. So I just wanted to point that out, and there's analysis as well. I've seen actually analysis that looks like it was done in a 3D environment with how far things were, where they're trying to calculate focal lengths and all that. We're not going to get into all that. We just wanted to let everyone know that the location has been confirmed. It's a real place, and it can be found with precise GPS coordinates even to this day.
Yeah, it's vastly overgrown now with vegetation, but I will say just very simply, it doesn't look like South or Southwestern Washington State. It looks like Northern California. Two separate, totally different things. And I believe even the location west of Yakima, where they thought it might have been hoaxed, doesn't look anything like that. The trees look different, the terrain, everything looks different.
Yeah, you can spot that kind of stuff. And it's funny because being a North Carolinian, and they've wound up undoing all the laws that made it a good state to shoot in. But in every time they ever shoot something in North Carolina, because I'm familiar with the flora and fauna, I spot it immediately. You spot it immediately. Even 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, it was obvious to me that was a North Carolina mountain town. I knew it in about 10 seconds. You know your terrain. Anyway, so it's Bluff Creek. That's where it took place. We all know that. There is no dispute about that with any party involved in investigating the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Getting back to the 3 Russians, though.
Yes.
Burtsev and Bayanov, I think, had some pretty interesting, I think just attitude-wise, really good comments about this in general. They seem to be guys that we would like to hang out with and talk to. Similar approach and ideas about how to do research and look at these kind of stories. Here's a good quote. According to Dr. Thorington Jr. of the Smithsonian, now he's talking about that, remember the viewing way back at the Smithsonian? So this is not too long after that.
Yeah.
Quote, one should demand a clear demonstration that there is such a thing as Bigfoot before spending any time on the subject. And that is the internal quote here. And then I believe Burtsev goes on to say, if by a clear demonstration, Dr. Thorington means a live Bigfoot be brought to his office, then it would be more of a sight for a layman than for the discriminating and analytical mind of a scientist.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I love that quote.
So, yeah, what he's saying here is that, well, if you think you need a body, then, that's something that somebody who doesn't know anything about science would demand, not a scientist, because you don't actually need a scientist because, yes, it's true, you don't have physical access to the creature, but compare it to a doctor who diagnoses by looking at x-rays, or a geologist who studies Mars by looking at photos of the surface.
Also, here's the other thing about Dr. Thorington's quote. One should demand a clear demonstration that there is such a thing as Bigfoot. Here is a film that is a clear demonstration that there might be such a thing as, where do you start then? We can't start with the movie. We have to prove it first. But wait, there's a movie of it. Why isn't that the starting point?
It's not enough.
It drives me crazy.
I know. It's not enough for him. It's not enough for Greg Long or I would say most skeptics, which is just fine.
Bring me a skull first. Then I'll watch the movie.
Well,
fine.
You need to bring in, you got to bring in tissue, but that brings in ethical dilemmas nowadays that they may not have had back then. But even back then, people who had a chance to shoot at them, they couldn't bring themselves to it because they looked too human.
That story has been told quite a few times by people who have cited them, who had a moment where they could have shot a Bigfoot and they didn't because it did look too human to them.
Right. Here's a few more interesting things from their statements. Burtsev, Bayanov, and Dehinden co-authored a study titled Analysis of the Patterson-Gimlin Film, Why We Find It Authentic. An interesting statement from the study comes from sculptor Nikita Levinsky. He was a famous sculptor of the time, and he stated, quote, the better a costume from the anatomical point of view, the worse it would be from the viewpoint of biomechanics. A clever costume on a moving hoaxer would expose, not conceal, a fraud. End quote.
Right.
So that's his thinking as somebody who studies anatomy and
it's going to work one way or the other. Making it work both ways is nearly impossible.
Yeah, so, I take this to mean that a more anatomically accurate costume that was tight-fitting to the wearer, so it would be more, I guess, if you wanted, again, I'm thinking this person has to be a huge bodybuilder, with well-defined muscles for that to come through on a skin-tight suit made of spandex, which wasn't around at the time, but that this tight-fitting outfit then, if you didn't exactly look like Patty, would look more unrealistic when you're actually moving around in it. So it would have to be an extremely sophisticated and complicated suit with maybe, things that were moving on it to give that kind of jiggle and muscle mass appearance when it moves. A loose, detailed costume will let you get away with much more when you're moving in it.
Right.
That's why when you see a Bigfoot film and the legs look baggy, okay.
Well, that's what our costume looks like. No, and by the way, before this series is over, I do want to make a short film with the costume. I think I'm going to put it on and I'm going to do the compliant gait. And we're going to film it and see how crappy it looks.
Right.
And then that's going to be, now granted, our costume's cheap. And if you haven't seen our costume, that's only because you haven't been to patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where you can see a movie we made a few years ago there. It's right there. You don't have to become a patron to watch the movie. And you'll see our very good friend, Mark DeAndre, who was in the very early episodes of the show, in the Bigfoot costume. And you tell us if you think Mark looks like a real Bigfoot.
He made a good Bob Hieronymus. He's tall, he's in shape. He's a good actor. He fit very well.
Now, Bayanoff wrote, this is Dimitri number one. Bayanoff wrote a book called America's Bigfoot, Fact Not Fiction, from which the following statements were taken. Quote, "The success of this research is a triumph of broad-mindedness over narrow-mindedness and serves as an example to the world at large, which seems to be in dire need of such a lesson."
Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
Again, when you're not hung up on how you look, and of course, they benefit from their scientific community not being so hung up. Obviously, they're human beings too. There's petty rivalries, jealousies of one's theory over another. That's just going to happen with people. But in terms of just considering this stuff, they'll take a look at it and they will analyze it and take it seriously and see if there's anything there to it. Whereas we here in the States won't bother with that. And if you do, then you do suffer the wrath of your contemporaries.
Now it's time to talk about Dimitri number two. We had lots of Bobs, like I said. It's Russia. Now we got lots of Dimitris. This is Dr. Dimitri Donskoy.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Dimitri is the equivalent of Bob over there.
Well, I'm not saying it's the equivalent.
Okay.
But there are a fair amount of Dimitris.
As long as that's clear.
Dr. Donskoy is chief of the chair, which is my new favorite title. I'm chief of this chair that I'm sitting in. Chief of the chair of biomechanics at the USSR Central Institute of Physical Culture, Moscow, Russia. And of course, it's not the USSR anymore. This was his former title.
Right. And it's also not Moscow, Idaho, which is
a real city.
Well, yeah, but not too far from some purported Bigfoot areas.
Yes, this is a different Moscow, Bigfoot Moscow.
Right.
Anyway, Moscow, Russia. Dr. Donskoy had a favorable conclusion about the film. Now, this analysis deals specifically with the movement and physicality of the creature, Patty, on the film. Now, after careful examination of the walking motion in the film and the stills from it, Dr. Donskoy's impression was that it demonstrated a fully spontaneous and highly efficient pattern of locomotion.
Well, so does this help attribute to what witnesses say, when they see claims of Bigfoot moving very quickly? Albert Ostman, remember that?
Yeah.
The thing covered tremendous ground in a short amount of time. And also, Fred Beck's ape story. Remember, they shot one multiple times. They were sure they hit it. They go to the spot where it should have fallen dead, and they see this thing running up the hillside.
Yeah.
Up the side of the canyon.
I mean, if they're real, if you believe any of this at all, and they're real, and they live in the woods where they've lived for generations, for however long, who knows where they came from, but I think the implication is if you're not going with a supernatural explanation,
right,
which I know some people are.
Well, none of these guys are either.
They've been around for a long time, and they've evolved from a species that is very adept at getting around in the woods and also adept at staying hidden,
right,
which belies a high level of intelligence.
Well, there's two opposing theories here from the people who love Bigfoot. I wouldn't say the scientists love it. No, some are actually very interested in the phenomenon and want to study it as a natural, previously undiscovered or uncatalogued primate creature.
Isn't it so nice that we don't have reputations we have to worry about? We can just talk about
sort of
whatever we want.
We can worsen ours.
We've got nothing to lose.
Whatever we have, we can cheapen it, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Not too far to go, but that can happen. But my point is that scientists here, as you'll see, really want to study it. The ones that take it seriously and think it could be real, it could be a possibility with these reports. It's just that it's been undiscovered and unknown to science, somewhere between what we know as gorillas and orangutans and humans. And there are some, as we'll see, that actually attribute it to the class of Gigantopithecus blacki, a giant ape that used to exist and maybe still does, extant. But what we're looking at here on the other side, and what I was referencing, was that there are those who do believe that maybe there is some kind of skinwalkery type of supernatural element to them that allows them to move so quickly and disappear. And, so we all kind of know about that.
Yeah, well, we'll bring that up in our conclusions, I think. I feel sure that's going to come up.
Right. But you're not going to get that from these serious scientists. They're going to study it as a real creature with specific walking habits.
Right. And what Dr. Donskoy said essentially was that in all the strides of movement, there was good coordination with the arms and legs, or what is known as cross-limb coordination. He said the creature has big, energetic strides. When a human makes those long strides, they walk very fast, and the momentum created overcomes the braking effect of the leg being put that far forward. Momentum is proportional to mass and speed. So the more massive the biped, the less speed is needed to overcome the braking effect of the legs when striding. The opposite is true. The less mass, the more speed needed to overcome the braking effect. Now, I would interpret this as meaning if a human were making those big strides, they might appear to be jogging or looking more like a speed walker.
Yeah, so you understand the concept here. You have that weight and momentum of a large, heavy mass moving forward. If a human were to do that, then when you put your foot that far forward, it's slowing you down to do that.
Right.
That's the braking effect. You have to overcome that loss of momentum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The character of the swinging movements indicate massive, strong arm muscles. Now, Dr. Donskoy also said that the creature's legs bend with each heel strike, absorbing the shock of the very heavy weight with each step. You can see certain leg muscles tensing in preparation for each powerful toe-off, contributing to the rapid forward progression. This is something that you would not notice if, for example, and this is our own observation, if you had Bob Hieronymus wearing a cowboy outfit, which likely would be a button-down shirt and blue jeans, and having that underneath this Bigfoot suit that he said he had, you wouldn't be able to see that.
Yeah, it's kind of a reminder. We did talk a little bit about this when Bob had his claims that he wore his clothes, his street clothes, under the costume. So,
Right.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then it's much less likely, unless he was rippling with muscles, that you're going to see even a skin-tight suit kind of feature the muscle movement that some of these experts are seeing in the right places and tensing and relaxing properly with the motion, either walking or
Right.
arm swing. You can see deltoids on her too, so
Yeah.
either it's a very sophisticated suit with some kind of silicone gel pads or something that mimic the appearance of muscles in all the right places, or it is a skin-tight suit on a Charles Atlas type bodybuilder guy who is so well defined that the skin-tight suit with the fur glued onto it is giving the appearance of this natural muscle movement.
Dr. Donskoy also goes on to say such considerable knee flexion is not observed in normal human walking and is only practiced in cross-country skiing. And this is significant. We wanted to point out what's interesting about this is that you hear this with a lot of Bigfoot sightings when they say they see this creature walking from all over the world.
Mhm.
People will say it looked like it was cross-country skiing. So
Yeah.
that's something that's consistent in what people are seeing. Donskoy goes on to add that this motion makes it appear that the creature is very heavy. He also said the leg joints exhibit considerable flexion, specific to massive limbs with well-relaxed muscles. The movement is fluid and easy, with no breaks or jerks in the extreme points of each cycle. So the overall point here is that Patty is not exerting too much effort in spite of how big she is.
Right. She's well muscled, but relaxed, but moving at a good clip. But it would seem whoever hoaxed this then is exhibiting a fluid motion for a large bipedal primate of that type. But again,
It's not Ripley in the dock loader.
but it's genius in that if it's a guy in a suit, then it's clever in that they altered it slightly, just enough so that it's not human, so that it would make these experts wonder about it and cause such debate. In that, you could have a guy in a suit, but look, if you're kind of bumbling around, they're not thinking that far ahead, or their thinking is not that sophisticated. So the guy's just walking like a big dude in a suit. And then these experts would say, look, he's just a dude in a suit. That's normal human walking. And not to say that this walk couldn't be duplicated by a human. Now, what's interesting, as we'll get to it, is that some experts say it can't be duplicated. Some say yes. And that's a big rift between equally credentialed and studied and learned professors and scientists who are just disagreeing on that point.
Yeah, and I think when you go to that, you have to think about the difference between just saying duplicated and precisely duplicated.
Exactly.
Anyone
Right.
can imitate Patty's walk.
Right.
Doing it in the exact way that it stands up to a critical analysis
Mhm.
is what these scientists are arguing about, whether or not a person can do that.
Exactly.
And then the
yeah.
whole variable comes in about the frame rate thing with the camera.
Right.
So there's a lot of factors going into those assessments.
Yeah, and the other, hard to assess thing with this is that you don't have somebody coming forward who said, I'm the guy in the film, and this is how I did it. Now take a close look. So you sort of had that with Bob Hieronymus demonstrating his walk for author Greg Long and his wife Pat Long. and them saying, well, there you go, there's the walk, he did it. But that's not scientific at all.
No, I could step right out here in my backyard and do it too. That doesn't mean that I'm the guy in the suit.
No, it looks
just for the
similar,
record. And
right.
I can do an imitation of the walk. And I can't remember, how tall is Hieronymus? We might be about the same height.
He's like,
he's kind of tall.
yeah, he's 6'4", 6'5", I think.
Yeah, I'm 6'2". He was also cut at this time. He was very built.
Yeah.
He was a muscular dude. So just that is important to consider. All right, well, getting back to Dr. Donskoy, he pointed out additionally that the strides are very confident and regular with no signs of loss of balance, wavering, or redundant movements. The sole of the creature's foot is large for the height by human standards. Unlike a human foot, there is no longitudinal arch visible, which may be a factor of the very heavy weight of the creature. The heel portion of the foot extends a considerable ways back. This helps the body with standing and aids the muscles by increasing force propulsion for walking. And what we're saying here about the heel extending back is that when you look down at your own foot, generally, the back of your leg and your heel are pretty closely aligned vertically. But what we're saying about Patty is that where the break is, where the vertical part of her leg is actually sits a little bit forward of where the end of her heel is. So that's an interesting observation. And here's some final quotes from Donskoy's analysis. Since the creature is man-like and bipedal, its walk resembles in principle the gait of modern man. But all the movements indicate that its weight is much greater, its muscles especially much stronger, and the walk swifter than that of a man. And here's another quote from him as well. On the whole, the most important thing is the consistency of all the above-mentioned characteristics. They not only simply occur, but interact in many ways. And all these factors taken together allow us to evaluate the walk of the creature as a natural movement without any signs of artfulness, which would appear in intentional imitations. And one last quote from Dr. Donskoy. At the same time, with all the diversity of human gaits, such a walk as demonstrated by the creature in the film is absolutely non-typical of man.
Well, there you go. I mean, and other scientists would say, well, that's his opinion.
Yes.
Because there are some that say, yeah, outwardly it appears to be non-human. Of course, we can all see that. But their argument would be that it is duplicatable by a human in maybe just a few minutes of practice or being taught to do that. But whether or not somebody knew to do that, that's another question. And much of this technology that is being used to analyze bipedal mobility, it has improved quite a bit since these analyses from the scientists of the 70s. And several have disagreed with these Russian scientists, of course. And of course, these Russian scientists disagree with each other's findings all the time. So even though the technology has improved since these times in the 70s, some things have not really changed. And what's funny is some of these principles of motion and mobility are still being debated today, no matter the technology. It's not like technology has solved all of our problems and have made scientists all stand on the same page in agreement. So again, that's probably just human nature in your course of study and what you believe. As we've always talked about, even with archaeology or whatever it is, experts disagree all the time and will always continue to do so. So what we're going to do now, though, is take a look at some of the, I wouldn't call them more unfavorable views, but ones that are either on the fence or still have questions, still have some doubts about the validity of the film or its intentions or what's actually on the film and what that thing is actually doing, to some who just believe that, yeah, I don't know, this seems more like a hoax than it does real, which is all they can say. None of them really go out and solve the mystery that it's been debunked and it's a fake.
All right, so who are we going to talk about first here?
Well, one of them is a renowned anatomist from England, D.W. Grieve. At the time, he gave an analysis of the film, and he knows his stuff. He's a reader in biomechanics of the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine in London, England. But he was also kind of on the fence about the film, too. And I love, he has a few good quotes coming up here, which I love, because he took a serious look at it and really studied it. And again, when it comes to biomechanics, he really knows what he's doing and talking about here. But one thing you have to keep in mind about Grieve, as well as all these other scientists, we have a poor set of data by their standards and a limited one. It's just this film, which is old. It's not high def. So it's very clear, as we've said before, but it's limited. So his views kind of depend on the specifics about the film that could be ascertained at the time or are just unavailable at that time. So he's given a limited data set is what we're saying, as well as the rest of these. So you have to keep that in mind. Well, mainly, two conclusions regarding the film speed and the authenticity of the creature were made by Dr. D.W. Grieve, who is that biomechanical expert in London. One was that if the film was shot at 16 or 18 frames per second, a human being could not duplicate Patty's walking pattern. If the film was shot at 24 frames per second, the walking pattern could be duplicated. Primatologist John Napier came to a similar conclusion. He's another bigwig we're going to talk about later on here. But Grieve's goal was to compare the creature's gait, how it resembled or differed to that of a human gait. And the parameters for comparison were stride length, time of leg swing, speed of walking, and the angular movements of the lower limb. The problem is that these measurements are known for humans under optimal conditions, which was not what Patty was walking in, and not at a consistent line in the film frame. So that's why I was talking about like bad data that you're going off of here.
Right. So the point is, Patty is not standing on a stage with the little half circles behind her, like every, Mythbusters experiment in yellow and black bars for you to check.
Yeah.
And they don't have a standard for that for humans either.
Right.
They
Edward
don't have
Muybridge. He's walking in front of a black screen.
Right. Edward Muybridge didn't shoot. I mean, people probably don't even know who we're talking about.
Go look it up.
But he didn't shoot that. And all the studies that have been done about human locomotion were not done in the Bluff Creek stream bed.
So the comparison,
you can't make a direct comparison.
Exactly. It's not scientific. So since we have all this human data from a pretty good data set of the variations of different types of people, how tall they are, how they walk, you compare that known quantity to something that is really unknown in this film. Now, if you could get Patty on a stage, or Bob Hieronymus, or whoever it was that people claim is the guy that hoaxed it, then you could make a comparison. But you don't have that. So again, there are a lot of factors about this film that are not ideal, but at least you have this clip. You have a good sequence of walking, although a lot of it's jerky, it's bumpy. These guys did not have stabilization at the time. So that's another factor that didn't help. But from what they could tell, these are their observations. Now, this is interesting, though, about the film speed, because if the film speed were 16 frames per second, then, quote, this is from Dr. Grieve, the cycle time and the time of swing are in typical human combination, but much longer in duration than one would expect for the stride and pattern of limb movement. It is as if a human were executing a high-speed pattern in slow motion. I found that to be fascinating. So again, that's if the film speed were 16 frames per second. Now, same thing for filming at 18 frames per second. Unless the intrinsic properties of the limb muscles or the nervous system were greatly different to that in man. If the framing speed was at 24 frames per second, then, according to Grieve, then the creature walked very similar to a man walking at high speed. If the framing speed were even higher, then the similarities increase.
I just want to remind everyone that Roger Patterson himself told John Green, Bigfoot researcher John Green, that he shot the film at 18 frames per second. However, the K100 does not have an 18 setting. It has a 16 setting.
Right.
On the other hand, we know that there have been experiments done that show that the K100, even when it's at 16, actually shoots at 18. Bill Munns, in particular, he bought 10 of the cameras, I think, and you're going to be hearing from him in a later part of the series. He's the special effects expert and costume designer, and has also done the most involved film analysis of the film that's ever been done in history. But anyway, so the point of this is just we wanted to remind you why these frame rates are important, and to point out that Roger Patterson never said that he shot this film at 24 frames per second to anyone.
Right.
Yeah. And he may have also known that the 16 was really 18. So that when he said 18, he may have known that it would have been at 18 even if the dial was on 16. But again, as Forrest said earlier in the series, additionally, the frames per second dial did not have click stops. It was analog.
Right. So here's a few interesting conclusions by Grieve. One, quote, I can see the muscle masses in the appropriate places. If it is a fake, it is an extremely clever one. Boy, weren't we going to get tired of hearing that?
Yeah, it just keeps coming back.
Right. But that's their opinion from that point on down when you're on the fence.
You know what I like about that is that a lot of the scientists like to say if it's a fake. they're not staking a claim on that because they know that scientifically they can't deduce that. However, many of the skeptics and debunkers are like, it's a fake.
Well, there's a lot of people.
The scientists are saying, well, if it is, it's really good.
Right.
The skeptics just say it's a fake, and then they circle around to why all the reasons that they think it is. So not all of them, by the way.
I would say debunkers, because that is the more extreme where you just know. You don't need any proof. You just know it's got to be a guy in a suit. How do you know that? Well, you just know. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Right.
And that's what they would say. Well, Grieve has some interesting final conclusions here with his paper in being on the fence, from a scientist's point of view, being on the fence with this kind of thing, which I thought were interesting, because he also states that his, quote, subjective impressions have oscillated between total acceptance of the Sasquatch based on the grounds that the film would be difficult to fake to one of irrational rejection based on an emotional response to the possibility that the Sasquatch actually exists. So he's like,
Right.
I can't wrap my head around that. If this thing is real, I don't tend to want to accept that. He's being honest. I thought that was fascinating. Although Grieve says, quote, the possibility of a very clever fake cannot be ruled out on the evidence of the film because a man could have sufficient height and suitable proportions to mimic the longitudinal dimensions of the Sasquatch, end quote. However, the wide shoulders would be difficult to achieve without making the arm swing and shoulder contours look unnatural. That's his thinking as well. So again, I think that's a fair position, is that he just can't rule it out just based on the film, that it's not a hoax. But there are definitely some peculiar aspects to what he's seeing. Now, Grover Krantz and John Green disagreed with Grieve and thought he made errors with his measurements and reference points. But Grieve admitted that he was perplexed and unsettled that the creature might be real. We love working with sponsors that are always thinking of new ways to innovate and improve their product lines. It keeps things fresh, which is what Quip is doing on several levels.
What are you talking about?
Well, you did have trouble getting your son to brush regularly when he was younger, right?
As with most kids, it wasn't easy getting him to do anything regularly, but he's getting older now, so he's becoming more mature and wants to do more grown-up things. But I see where you're going with this. You're talking about Quip's new kid version of an electric toothbrush.
Indeed I am. So now the whole family can get refreshed with Quip.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad there's now a really effective toothbrush for kids that isn't just a marketing gimmick for some superhero or animated series, Plus, the kids' toothpaste seem more like candy, which is probably their goal, and none of it really got my son into a better brushing routine. But the kids' Quip is the same quality electric toothbrush as their original, just downsized for smaller mouths, and it comes with rubber grip handles in colors that kids love. Now, I know parents have all been sold that everything has to look like a cartoon or your kids won't use it, but actually, kids are inspired to brush better and more often with oral care that looks and feels like the products they see their adults using. And that leads to a healthy brushing habit.
And the important thing is that the kids' version has all the same features that make the original Quip so effective and easy to use. It's got the same 2-minute timer with guiding pulses and sensitive sonic vibrations for an effective clean that's gentle on anyone's gums, all leading to a grown-up brushing routine that isn't just a gimmick to get you to buy more toys.
Well, one habit I don't want my son to get into is brushing too hard, which will lead to an adult life of gum problems. But I also do want him to get into a routine he doesn't have to think about. And it's great that he's digging Quip's watermelon anti-cavity toothpaste. And I'm digging that new toothpaste and new brush heads are automatically delivered on a dentist-recommended schedule. So that's something I don't have to think about. And that's why I love Quip.
And why over 1 million happy, healthy mouths do too. Quip starts at just $25, and if you go to getquip.com/legends right now, you can get your first refill pack for free.
That's your first refill pack free at getquip.com/legends.
Hi, I'm Jenny in Aviano, Italy. When I'm not practicing my Italian, I'm listening to the Astonishing Legends podcast. E ora torniamo allo show. Ciao!
Okay, now, as I was talking about a few minutes ago with the frame rates, we want to go a little bit deeper on that, and we've touched on this off and on up until this point in the series. But what you can tell is that for all of these scientific analyses, the film speed, or the number of frames per second that the film was shot at, is greatly significant and can alter the scientific analysis for some of these experts. Igor Bortsev also analyzed the significance of the film speed. The Kodak K100 that Roger Patterson shot on had settings for the film at 16, 24, 32, 48, and 64 frames per second. Bortsev concluded that the film was shot at 16 frames per second by analyzing the vertical oscillations on the image as Patterson was running while filming. As we've told you, there's a point at which he runs, and that's part of the reason it's so shaky before it was stabilized here in the past decade or so. It's very shaky, and he's running. So Bortsev was able to take a look at that and make a calculation on the frame rate. Grover Krantz, going off Bortsev's calculations, said since we know Patterson's height was 5'2" or 5'3", you can reasonably calculate Patterson's running pace towards Patty and then match the bounces in the film to determine the shooting frame rate. Again, the most analyzed film besides the Zapruder film. It's just amazing how much people have looked at this. It's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Based on that information, Krantz believes you can rule out 24 and 16 frames per second and settle on an actual frame rate of 18 frames per second. And I just want to remind you, as we said before, it's thought that these cameras, even when set to 16, actually shot at 18. Now, if Grieve and Bortsev are correct about the lower frame rate of shooting, then the walking pattern, according to them and several others, could not be duplicated by a human. Now, Bortsev incidentally also discovered a detail from the sole of the left foot in a still frame, which corresponded to a detail in a plaster cast. And that's very interesting because it makes a direct connection between Patty and the footprint impressions, which one might think would need to be created separately in the event of a hoax to be most effective.
What it says is that those casts were made from whatever
that thing was that was walking.
Right. So it either had to exactly match if it was a wooden footprint of some kind or some kind of a hoax machine that generated a lot of weight and depression into the soil. It had to match what was seen in the film.
Right. Now, this is where it gets super fascinating. Renee DeHinden and others examining the incident site in Bluff Creek tried duplicating walking quickly in Patty's path and noted that none of them could speed walk it in 40 seconds. So he eliminated 24 frames per second as the filming rate. He also noticed that the previous horseback footage looks unnatural and jerky when it's projected at 24 frames per second. So just to make that clear, when you project a film at a rate that it wasn't shot at, it looks funny. This is how they made the Keystone Cops movies. It either looks sped up or slowed down if it's not at the right frame rate. The other thing you can do mathematically, and what DeHinden did, was say, okay, well, if it was shot at this frame rate, we know exactly how long it would take to traverse the area that Patty walked, so we're going to try to walk it in the corresponding amount of time. So that's how they're making these calculations. Now, Patterson himself said that he normally shot at 24 frames per second, but in all the excitement, he didn't notice what frame rate setting the camera was on until later. According to Grover Krantz, Patterson clearly told John Green, as I said, that after the filming, he noticed the camera was set to 18 frames per second. Some people, however, think Patterson misidentified 18 for 16 because the camera does not have a marking for 18. It has one for 16, but not 18. And again, reminding you, the Cine Kodak K100 doesn't have any click stops between its settings of 16, 24, 32, 48, and 64. It's just numbers on the outside of the dial, and you rotate that dial to line up the little mark roughly with the right frame rate.
Yeah, meaning you could get the camera to shoot at any rate in between those. It's a sliding dial, you could say.
Yes.
So you could have it physically set between 16 and 24.
Yes.
But you normally wouldn't want to do that. If you're filming, you want to keep things consistent. Before you were going to do a normal shooting session, you would have it to one of those at your preference.
Yes, and back then it was very hard to build a camera like that mechanically that would shoot at a specific rate and offer multiple rates in a variable way that would have hard stops for all the frame rates. That's why that dial was adjustable like that. They didn't have the ability to build an affordable camera that would allow you to click stop at 16, 24, 32, and 48. This was an accessible camera for the people.
Was it?
Yeah, because the technology wasn't there. They would have done it if they could, because the last thing you want is some kind of crazy variable frame rate, because then you got to match your projector up to it later. It was as state-of-the-art as it could be for its price point in this state of technology. Now, according to special effects makeup expert and film analyst Bill Munns, who is, again, the guest of our show, and you'll be hearing from him before the series is done, he'd heard via a researcher named Bill Miller that a Kodak technician had reported that even when the cameras are set to shoot at 16 frames per second, the mechanism actually shoots at 18. Munns went out and bought, as we said a minute ago, 9 K100 cameras, and he has tested at least one of them and is going to continue to test the others. And actually, I meant to ask him about this. I'm going to send him an email and see if he's done any more, and we will get back to you on that.
Right.
So now, you know who we should talk about is Dr. Grover Krantz, who has my favorite first name. I love Grover. So
From Sesame Street.
Yeah, from Sesame Street. Is a different guy, but who knows? Maybe they're named for each other. Forrest, why don't you tell us about Dr. Krantz?
Well, as we've heard quite a bit, he's probably the most notable, or I guess at this point, famous in the Bigfoot research fields here for being a proponent of the Patterson Gimlin film. Now, he was a physical anthropologist specializing in evolutionary anthropology and primatology. And he became famous, or I guess notorious, for being one of the few scientists in that field to actually study Bigfoot beginning in 1963 and the Patterson Gimlin film and actually take it seriously. And he eventually came to be a proponent of it, although not at first. Well, Krantz was kind of a known figure in my region, at least with the older set, because he taught at Washington State University, WSU, Wazoo, for 30 years, writing 10 books on human evolution and authoring over 60 academic papers. So he was the right type of expert to study this phenomenon, you could safely say.
Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well,
60 academic papers. Come back to me when it's somebody that's written 70.
Right. And the fact, though, that he, has an emphasis in evolutionary anthropology and primatology. But
what does that have to do with Patty?
Like I said, it doesn't matter what you've studied, how many papers, all that. Another scientist or a group of them or the whole field could very readily disagree with your findings. And of course, that's what happened here. But Krantz first saw Patty as still frames from the film when they were published in a February 1968 issue of Argosy magazine. And at this first sighting, he thought they were some part of an elaborate hoax, stating that it looked like, quote, someone wearing a gorilla suit, end quote, and that he only gave Sasquatch a 10% chance of being real. But it wasn't until Krantz examined the Cripplefoot plaster casts that were taken in Bossburg, Washington, in December of 1969, that he started to believe in Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, as he called them, which is my preferred term just because it's more fun to say.
Sasquatch.
Yeah. The tracks were left in the snow, these Cripplefoot tracks, and it was because they had microscopic dermal ridges, or what we know as fingerprints. I think that's what fascinated him so much about these, along with a condition thought to be clubfoot, or as it's known, Talipes equinovarus, which we talked about in the Loftus Hall series. The devil, that's why. Yes. Anne freaked out. She saw
possibly she mistook someone with a clubfoot for the cloven foot of the devil.
But imagine seeing a Bigfoot track like that. You'd, again, very clever.
I definitely want to know if Ray Wallace created
he may have
a wooden
variables
footprint with a clubfoot Bigfoot.
I don't know. Again, it's a clever
That's right up there with putting boobs on it.
And it is part of that. It is part of the variations that have kept people baffled. And you would say, well, of course, that's what a hoaxer would do. They'd throw in something that, baffles people. And sometimes it happens. But often these jokesters, they're having a laugh and they're not that critical about it. Because as you would see from experience and history, they often are usually caught, because there is a very hokey aspect to it, which is easily detectable. Well, Krantz was compelled to such a degree that he had both the FBI and Scotland Yard analyze the dermal ridges and heard back from Scotland Yard that their conclusion was that they were, quote, probably real, end quote. That's all. I saw that in the wiki entry. I just thought, like, what? Probably real, or that's
probably
real.
They're probably real.
Seems it's very accurate, I think, is their assessment there. Well, Bossburg, Washington, was also where Krantz met John Green, and they remained lifelong friends after that. Roger Patterson was one of those who went up to the Bossburg site at that time to check out the prints, which advocates would say shows that he was genuinely interested in the phenomena. He regularly went out and
but the opposing viewpoint there.
Of course he would go there.
Right. I mean, just to be fair, because I'm a proponent of believing Roger and Bob Gimlin, but still, the opposing viewpoint would say that it's possible, and I want to make clear that I'm accepting this possibility. It's possible that he both believed in Bigfoot and hoaxed it.
Oh, that is also, of course.
So you can't just say, I get that you can't say, well, why would he go there?
If he wasn't serious.
If he hoaxed it. And it's like, no. And this is something that we just briefly, we've talked about before. Folks that are in this position, and especially something that they become particularly obsessed with, often want to recreate something that they witnessed and did not get any evidence of,
Mm-hmm.
or they're so desperate to convince everyone else that it's real, they hoax it because of that.
Yeah,
Because they
yeah.
want everyone to believe, because they believe, even if they've never actually seen it themselves. So I do accept that possibility, although it is still irrelevant to the empirical evidence of the film itself in this case.
Yeah, again, you have to ignore that. None of this proves anything, really. Not to bury the lead or give a spoiler away, but none of these people have definitively proven the PGF one way or the other, which is why we're talking about it now. Well, we
Yes,
might still
a
be
lot.
talking about it if it were a really clever hoax that just people believe for 30 years and suddenly, boom, we found out it wasn't. Like, wow, what went on there that had people fooled for so long?
Well, and what bugs
Certainly.
me the most about that is that a lot of people think that after Bob Hieronymus came out and said it was me, I wore a costume, they did that. They got their cognitive closure. They shut down and they decided, oh, yeah, that story's a hoax. There's so much more to it. There's so much more to it.
I hope we've shown that. Well,
Yeah.
anyway, Grover Krantz was kind of one of those people who just said, that looks kind of fake to me. We saw the stills, but he finally analyzed the PGF thoroughly. And after studying Patty's particular walk and factors like her leg muscles, flexing, he became convinced of the film's authenticity. And Krantz is one of the few scientists to even bother looking at the film. And Patterson thought most scientists would be interested because he believed in the footage as proof, finally, of Bigfoot. He just, I guess, maybe being naive or hoping that it would just go viral in the scientific community, he just thought like, well, here you go. You guys are going to be interested in this, right? I mean, look at this.
This is, again, my second reason that Krantz is one of my favorite guys involved in this. The first one being, and I'll remind everyone, that you can see his skeleton
Oh,
that he donated to science, along with the skeleton of one of his favorite Irish wolfhounds standing on its back legs and giving him a hug all the way up at his shoulders.
yeah.
How cool is that? That's how he is currently preserved.
Well, he was
What a cool dude.
he was
And also, he
an
wasn't
unconventional
afraid
thinker.
to look
No.
into this.
No.
And that takes courage.
Yeah, no, his career, you could say, suffered greatly. I think it delayed his tenure and it caused him problems, but I applaud the guy for at least standing up for what you believe in. I mean, I get it when people don't, because look, you got to feed your family. You got to publish books. You got to,
Yeah, it's
you got to
understandable.
make a living. I
You
get
don't want to
that.
risk
So,
your entire reputation,
Yeah.
but I admire the people that do.
yeah, he believed in it. And so, if you believe in something, it takes a bit of courage to stand up for it, right or wrong. Well, here are a few points about the criticisms that Krantz wrote about in his book, Bigfoot Sasquatch Evidence. Now, these points he's going to make here are in defense or explanation of the common, more scientific objections about the film, as other scientists have put forward. Krantz confirms that human females generally walk different than males, but there is no such contrast in apes. This is because of the female human pelvis being wider for our big heads.
Speak for yourself.
All right, let's not go there. Apes are born with much smaller brains, and their two sexes have more nearly the same pelvic design. Quote, of course the female Sasquatch walks more like a man than a woman, and that is exactly how she should walk, end quote. Krantz also confirms the reason for the sagittal crest. Remember that? The pointy head?
Yes, the conquistador helmet.
Yeah, the ridge that's freaky, but it does give her the appearance of a pointy head, which again, nice touch by the hoaxer. Krantz goes on to say, it's not a male characteristic, but a consequence of absolute size alone. As the body size increases, brain size increases at a slower rate than does the jaw.
Yeah, I'll just read a couple of sentences here from page 200 of Chris Murphy's book, The Bigfoot Film Controversy, which has Roger Patterson's complete book, Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist, which he wrote before the sighting, and then an update supplement that Chris Murphy wrote. And this is on page 200 regarding the sagittal crest. When jaw muscles become too large to find sufficient attachment on the side of the brain case, a sagittal crest develops. That size threshold is regularly crossed by all male gorillas and a few females, by most male orangutans, and by no other known primates. The evident size of the Sasquatch easily puts their females well over that threshold, and a sagittal crest would be an automatic development. The evident size of the Sasquatch easily puts their females well over that threshold, and a sagittal crest would be an automatic development.
Yes, once again, as body size increases, brain size increases at a slower rate than does the jaw. So what he's saying, though, that's not specific to the sexes of the male or female primate here. It's just about size.
Right. So that's a direct rebuttal for all those people that say, Well, how can it be a lady? It's got a man head. That's the answer to why that's not an accurate assessment.
Well, in relation to that, regarding the breasts, quote, that the species should have enlarged breasts at all, which is a human trait, is also a point of contention to some critics. But that they would be hair-covered in a temperate climate seems perfectly reasonable to me. So he's saying, I don't see what the problem is. Most of these apes that they're comparing them to live in hot, humid climates, usually have less hair. If you're in a colder climate like Patty, out in the woods, and it gets cold up there and snowy, why not have more fur?
As we promised, you will be an expert in Bigfoot booze by the end of this series.
Well, I don't know. You may not even want to think about that again, but those are some of his responses to the often, mainly 3 points that scientists bring up about Patty herself, looking at her and what they don't like about it. Looking specifically at the biomechanics and the 41-inch stride length displayed by Patty in the film, we've gotten these calculations from the source material, and we're going with them here, but there might be some discrepancies later on, so just keep a note of that. But in any case, here, with a 41-inch stride length displayed by Patty, Krantz's conclusion is that the PGF shows a genuine unknown animal. So here's a note I found when you're thinking about average stride length in humans, and this is from the Arizona State University Extension here online. A man's walking stride length is 2.5 feet, or 30 inches. A woman's average stride length is 2.2 feet, or 26.4 inches. And these are from the school's findings. In general, of course, people with longer legs have a greater stride length than those with shorter legs.
Well, that's a big old duh.
Yeah, mobility here factors. Well, the average human knee bend while walking is 70 degrees, but Krantz noticed Patty's knees on average bending more than 90 degrees. This has Patty lifting her foot off the ground with each step by at least 10 inches, toes to dirt, while a human only raises their foot 2 or 3 inches off the ground, as was noted by researchers Daniel Perez and Renee DeHinden.
Yeah, she's a high stepper.
It's a weird characteristic, again, another nice touch by the faker. It's noted that it would be hard for a human to raise the foot off the ground 10 inches or more while walking and still keep as smooth and as long a stride as Patty. Overall, Krantz contends that human foot and leg movement are very different from what you see in the film and not possible by a man wearing a gorilla costume. That was kind of his final statement there. He didn't think it was possible. Again, I'll just say, if it is a fake, weird walk that Bob Hieronymus made up to confound people, it's ingenious. Well, Krantz also noted the creature's apparent massive shoulders, estimating the width at just over 28 inches. Making them a little over 35% of the standing height he calculated at 78 inches, or about 6 foot 6 inches tall. So if you think about it, that's not the width across the chest. They're talking about over 28 inches, or at least Grover Krantz is talking about a shoulder width of 28 inches while you were looking directly at the shoulder. It's a little over 2 feet wide.
Right.
Picture that in your mind.
The Rock. That's what I'm thinking of.
Well, no, this is bigger than the...
No, but I'm saying we're
Rock.
looking at that arm with that big tattoo. That's the part. We're not looking at the back. We're looking at the side here.
Right, because, of course, that would be accounting for chest width, too. So it's not broad shoulders as we commonly think about it. It's the actual width of the shoulder straight on here. Now, Bob Hieronymus, he had wide shoulders, but he had a ratio of 27.4% ratio to standing height. And here's a fun comparison that's also in the wiki entry there. You talk about big guys. Andre the Giant had a typical human ratio of 24%. And very rarely do humans have a shoulder ratio of 30%. So Bob Hieronymus, he did have a wide shoulder ratio there to compare to standing height, but Patty's was 35%. So think about that. Andre the Giant, 24%, Patty, 35%. She could have wadded him up into a little piece of tinfoil.
By the way, the Rock's biceps, I just looked it up, 19 inches at his biceps, which isn't all the way up, even up at the shoulder, which is smaller.
Right, that's the circumference too, I think. So,
yes.
So again, rarely do humans have a shoulder ratio of 30%. This would make Patty's shoulder to height ratio 50% wider than the average human. Krantz would contend that you couldn't have the natural looking arm and hand movements you see in the film while wearing a suit with that much bulked up shoulders to match what you see Patty sporting.
I'd like to make a point that I haven't seen in any of our notes. So I think I'm making a fresh point.
I certainly hope it's fresh.
You're going to be like, we're getting to it later. But here it is. With regard to Hieronymus and the football shoulder pads, it occurs to me that if you're wearing those and you're in a costume, that they isolate the movement between the tops of your shoulders and your arms in an unnatural way.
Yeah.
Just like when you look at a football player on a football field,
Right.
you can see that there's not a direct relationship between how the tops of their shoulders are moving and their arms. And you would see the same thing if Bob Hieronymus was in a costume wearing shoulder pads, I would believe, in the Patty footage.
They don't move as much with you. So that's kind of the point that some of these proponents are saying, that the movement they see with clearly delineated muscle groups moving is very fluid. It's not stiff and jerky. It's not arms dangling underneath a contraption, whereas, football shoulder pads, they're connected under the armpits and tied off at the neck. And of course, they're a lot more stationary. They do move with you, but your arms move a lot more fluid. So what you see with Patty is you have deltoids and triceps and biceps moving with her, plus hand and finger movement that's curling up as she's walking. So very sophisticated. Well, now let's hear from two anthropologists who I think have done a pretty good job of studying the film and the walk, and they provide not so much a counterpoint to Grover Krantz's studies, because I think that they thought his methodology was fine. I think their main problem with his take on it is that he was so confident in his final conclusion that the walk scene in the film could not possibly be done by a human. So they went out to see if that was true themselves.
So David J. Daegling is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Florida and a biological anthropologist specializing in the study of primate anatomy and biomechanics. Daegling and his anthropologist associate Daniel O. Schmidt from Duke University examined the film and conducted their own studies of the creature's walking characteristics, comparing them to their own human experiments. Now, Daegling's book, which we've already mentioned in this series, came out in 2004. It's called Bigfoot Exposed: An Anthropologist Examines America's Enduring Legend. He had also taken a look at Grover Krantz's data and calculations, stating that Krantz's endorsement of the film was the first to do so by a systematic dissection of it, some 25 years after the incident. Daegling then summarizes his thoughts about Krantz's two specific arguments for the film's authenticity. First, that the creature's body proportions are outside the range of human populations and could not be achieved by a human wearing a costume. Secondly, that the gait of the creature is sufficiently distinct from that of living humans, enough so that a person couldn't duplicate the film subject's movements. Krantz used Bob Titmus's measurements from the site, which are questionable, in calculating his height estimates. Daegling states that Grover Krantz's calculation for her walking height, keeping in mind that she's sort of hunched over when she's walking.
Yeah, she's got that ape-like thing. She's kind of hunched over, big, huge trapezius.
Right. And what Krantz had said was that when she's doing that, her height is about 6 feet, but that if she was stopped and standing straight up, it would be closer to 6'6", well within human proportions. However, this conflicts with Chris Murphy's stating of Krantz's standing height measurement of 7.3 feet.
Yeah, that's what we found in the book. I saw that Chris Murphy stated Krantz's statement of 7.3 feet as a standing height. Now, keep in mind, that's if Patty stopped and unnaturally to her stood straight up, ramrod straight, she might reach 7.3 feet. So there's some discrepancy there, which probably the average listener out here doesn't care about.
Right. If her mom was trying to get her to stand up against the wall to put a pencil over her head to see how tall she was.
At the door frame of the kitchen, yes. But Krantz calculated that with that given height, and according to Daegling, he calculated a chest size of over 18 inches, with Krantz stating, quote, "I can confidently state that no man of such stature is built that broadly," end quote.